This is the first episode of a new series I'm doing called Vegan Family Recipes, where I veganize the traditional family recipes that you guys have sent me from all over the world. And I thought I'd kick off the first episode with a traditional family recipe of my own. So today we're going to be making vegan Norwegian meatballs with gravy, or Kjøttkaker med Brun Saus. This is a really traditional dish in Norway, and I feel like every family pretty much has some version of it. The meatballs are basically made with ground beef, onions, nutmeg, salt and pepper, sometimes white pepper, and they're served in a simple beef gravy with potatoes and Lingam berry sauce on the side. So meat and potatoes lovers will absolutely love this, whether they are vegan or not. It's super comforting and really hearty. My grandma made these meatballs all the time when I was a kid, and it's really great to have those same kind of comforting flavors and the rituals of my culture, but without involving animals, which is why I wanted to make this series, because food is about so much more than just taste. It's deeply connected to our memories, our sense of identity, and our cultural traditions, and we don't need to lose that just because we're vegan. So in this series, I'll be teaching you the vegan versions of your family recipes, but maybe my favorite part is that I'll also be sharing some pretty cool food science that you can use whenever you're veganizing a recipe at home. The more you know, the more confident you'll feel in the kitchen, and some of this stuff is really cool. So I made sure this video was jam-packed with useful information from start to finish, and I even get a little bit emotional at the end because this really is an extension of my heart. I feel so passionate about this, so I hope you guys enjoy the first episode of this series, and let's get started making these vegan Norwegian meatballs with gravy, just like my bestimaries to make them. The thing about family recipes is a lot of them are kind of memorized and done by sight or feel, which can make them difficult to replicate, but especially to veganize. So when making this meatball recipe, I talked to some of my family members. My mom found a original recipe in like an old Norwegian cookbook that my grandma used all the time. But I know for a fact that my grandma didn't actually look at a recipe when making meatballs for decades, because she made this so many times. And so because of that, and like most seasoned cooks, she kind of adapted the recipe over time based on what she had on hand and how many people she was cooking for and stuff like that. So we had an original recipe to go off of, which looks like this. But I got to the part where it says potato starch, and I thought, I don't remember growing up with potato starch around in the household. We had cornstarch, but I feel like my grandma used breadcrumbs. So I talked to my mom about it, talked to my cousin about it, and what we think is that my grandma originally made the recipe like this, and then later on, she kind of switched it and started using breadcrumbs instead. And so I decided to try it both ways and see which one works better. So instead of beef, I'm going to be using some vegan ground beef, and you can use any one of these brands up on the screen or whichever kind of vegan beef you have available to you. And then I'm going to add some finely diced yellow onion. I find that the yellow onion is nice and mellow and sweet. Then we're going to add salt, pepper, and I go for allspice, but you can also do nutmeg if you like. Then I'm going to add some vegan Worcestershire sauce, not just because I recently became comfortable with saying that word, thumbs up if you get the joke, but I'm going to add this because it adds a really nice meaty quality to any kind of vegan meatball, meatloaf, that sort of thing. Just like with baking, using an egg in a meatball recipe or a meatloaf recipe just acts as a binder, keeps it from falling apart. So instead of using a chicken's egg, I went for a flax egg, and it worked really well. So like I said, the original recipe calls for potato starch, and I remember my grandma using breadcrumbs. So I'm gonna try it two different ways, but basically they kind of work similarly. The starch is going to basically not only bind the meatball together, but it's also gonna hold on to moisture and keep it inside the meatball, basically preventing it from drying out, so you don't have something that's really dry and crumbly and falling apart. So it works as a binder, but also holds moisture. The breadcrumbs also have starch, so it's gonna do that same thing. But breadcrumbs also prevent meatballs and meatloafs from becoming too compact, because they basically prevent the proteins from drying out and kind of stacking on top of each other. It creates a little bit of separation, so you have a lighter, fluffier meatball that still has all that moisture inside of it. So my feeling when I was testing this was that the potato starch one was gonna be better, because I had the feeling that the breadcrumb version might be like, I don't know, you know how when people make crab cakes, they talk about breadcrumb being filler, or with meatballs, they talk about breadcrumb being filler, and that sounds like a bad thing. So I kind of thought that adding the breadcrumbs would just kind of like maybe dilute the flavor a little bit, maybe change the texture, maybe even be mushy inside of the meatball. I wasn't 100% sure, so I wanted to try it both ways and see which one was better. You can do this by hand, but I like to use a mixer because it prevents the meatball from becoming too compact, and you end up with a meatball that's a little bit lighter and more tender in the center. Before I roll all the meat into balls, I'm just gonna cook up a little bit of each one to see, one, if I like the texture, if I think it needs more breadcrumbs or more cornstarch, maybe more salt, more allspice, more onion, I don't know. We're gonna kind of just do a little baby taste of both of them just to make sure they're good, and then I'll roll them all out. I will say my grandma always used to fry them in butter. She loved butter. It was always a good layer of butter in the pan when she was cooking up the meatballs, and this made that really nice kind of like crust on the outside of them that I feel like is a big part of the flavor. But I will say that when I fried with vegan butter, I find that sometimes it burns easily, it kind of separates a little bit. So I'm going to use a neutral oil instead. We're still going to get that beautiful color and caramelization on the outside, but that way we're not going to have like burned bits of butter in the pan, because we actually want to use those juices for the gravy later on. So at first I was really just tasting for seasoning to make sure that I liked the amount of salt and pepper. Keep in mind this is going to be served with a gravy, and that's also going to be salty, so keep that in mind when you're adjusting the seasoning. But here I'm looking a little surprised because there actually wasn't a huge difference between the two. Let's make more. So at least flavor-wise, there's really no difference between the cornstarch version and the almost said bread starch version, but the breadcrumb version. So you can use either one, but you'll see a difference in texture later on. But when we're going to shape these, we're just going to go ahead and shape them into ovals. They're a little bit larger than other kinds of meatballs, like Swedish meatballs, which tend to be a little bit more ping pong ball shaped. These are larger, more like 3-bite meatballs, and they tend to be more oval shaped. So I'm going to go ahead and roll them out, and I just placed them on a baking sheet really just because I was taking a picture for the blog so you guys could see the texture. But this is a really simple old-fashioned recipe. These are not going in the oven. They're just going straight from the bowl we mixed it in directly onto the stove, and that's it. They cook really quick. So this is what they look like with the cornstarch. They hold together really nicely. The dough is just ever so slightly more wet, and this is what they look like with the breadcrumbs. So very similar, but texturally they have a little bit more kind of craggly bits on top, which means they're going to crisp up nicely on the stove. So I'm just cooking this in some neutral oil. You can use refined coconut oil or avocado oil would work really well. And we're just going to cook these for a few minutes on each side. You'll notice this is the cornstarch version, and they release a little bit more of the juices, but they do brown nicely on the outside. With the breadcrumb version, a lot more of that moisture stays into the meatball, which means you're keeping all the flavor inside. And they brown a little bit more like the ones I remember my grandma making. They have kind of crispy, kind of craggly edges, which get really delicious and golden brown. So I think the breadcrumb way is the way to go, but honestly, they're both good. I think the cornstarch version is a little bit softer overall, and there's a little bit more texture with the breadcrumb version. I think whenever you're veganizing something, it's really important to understand the food science, because if you understand how something works, then you can understand why it's in a recipe and whether or not it's kind of a non-negotiable in the recipe or not. You can figure out whether or not you can sort of leave it out, or if you could swap it for something similar. So in this recipe, I realized that starches play a pretty big role in not only the meatballs, but also the gravy. So I wanted to figure out what they do and how they work. And basically what I learned is that starch is made up of tiny little granules, and those granules contain 2 different kinds of glucose molecules. And so when starches are hydrated and introduced to heat, they basically swell and swell until they burst, and then they release those glucose molecules into the liquid. And those molecules kind of bump up against each other and slow everything down. So you can actually see that when you're making a sauce or a gravy. And as the mixture heats up, you see it go from kind of a rapid boil to a slower simmer, and everything kind of thickens as it heats, which is really cool to see. But really what's happening is we've changed the molecular structure of the liquid because we've now introduced these glucose molecules. So that's what's happening when you're adding flour to a gravy, for example. And now that you know that, you might better understand why you wouldn't want to swap out the flour for something like a almond flour. It wouldn't work the same way because the almond flour doesn't have those glucose molecules. Instead, something like chickpea flour would work because that's going to have those starchy glucose molecules that will work in the same way as the wheat flour. So you want something starchy to thicken it, not just flour, any kind of flour. Does that make sense? Here's a few more starches that function as thickening agents. These are great for sauces or desserts like chocolate pudding or chocolate mousse, or when making gravy. And to veganize my grandma's gravy, I just had to replace 2 things. The first is I did vegan butter instead of cow's butter, and flour is going to be the thickening agent here. And I'm just going to whisk this together to create a roux. And this roux is going to be what thickens the gravy and makes it really smooth and creamy and thick. And I'm using a silicone whisk for this so that I don't have any lumps in the gravy, but I'm also not damaging my nonstick pans. This is non-stick cookware approved. So I'll link the one that I have in the description box below. It's really handy for stovetop sauces like this. But I'm just gonna let this cook for a couple of minutes until it turns a deep golden brown color. Then I'm gonna slowly add in my beef broth. This is a vegan-friendly beef broth that will replace the beef broth in my grandma's recipe. You can use a vegetable broth if you like, but I found these vegan beef broth bouillon cubes that work really well. The original recipe only has butter, flour, beef broth, salt, and pepper. That's it. And so beef broth is a pretty important component in this recipe, so it's really cool that there's a vegan option. This is still a vegetable-based broth and vegan-friendly, but it just has different spices that make it taste a little more meaty, a little more savory, a little more umami-y than a vegetable broth. But I did test this recipe with regular vegetable broth and also the vegan beef broth, and the recipe in the description box below will have both versions. I also will link the vegan beef broth cubes that I found at the grocery store in the description box below if you want to order them online. They're really great not only for this recipe, but you can use them to make things like vegan French onion soup, or if you wanted to make an au jus sauce for a French dip style sandwich, this would work really well because it does have a very specific flavor. But anyway, you're going to go ahead and add your broth, and you want to whisk this in slowly. So you do a little at a time, whisk, add a little at a time until it's completely combined. And this is going to prevent the gravy from becoming lumpy. If you do too much at once, it'll be really hard to stir the roux that we made into the liquid, and it will just never be totally smooth. So we're gonna let this thicken, just kind of simmer and thicken for a couple of minutes, and then we'll add the meatballs right back in. You wanna go ahead and season with salt and pepper to taste, just because every broth is gonna be slightly different, so you wanna do this to your taste preference, but this is a very simple gravy that mostly gets its flavor from the meatballs later on. Now, if you've ever had Swedish meatballs, you may have noticed that the gravy can be really light in color and very creamy. And there's two reasons why some gravies are really light in color and other ones get this deep golden brown color. The first has to do with how long you let the roux cook in the pan. So basically, if you're making something like a turkey gravy, you just add the butter and flour, and pretty quickly as it becomes a paste, you add your broth and it stays that light palish beige color. But with this recipe, you really want to let the flour toast in the pan until it becomes like a deep golden brown. This again is one of the main flavor components because there's not a lot of ingredients in this gravy. It's a very straightforward, very simple gravy because most of the flavor comes from the meatball itself. And so allowing the flour and butter to toast into a golden brown paste before you add the broth, that's really what gives it its deep color. The other thing that makes a lighter creamy gravy like a Swedish meatball gravy is the addition of cream. A lot of times they'll add cream right at the end once the gravy is all thickened and ready to go. It's just kind of a final step to add a little bit more lightness and creaminess. So that's usually the biggest difference between Swedish meatball gravy and Norwegian gravy. You probably can't tell from this video because I'm going into quite a lot of detail, but you can have this dinner recipe on the table in 20 minutes. It's really simple, and Norwegian recipes in general tend to be kind of no fuss. There's really only a handful of ingredients going on here, and once you get the hang of it, you can whip this up really quickly. I usually have a pot of potatoes boiling alongside of this with some vegetables steaming in another pot, and dinner can be ready in no time at all. It's a really quick and easy and hearty dinner. Like a lot of Norwegian recipes, these meatballs are traditionally served with tiny little potatoes that have just been peeled and boiled. They're really, really tender, and we kind of just sprinkle with salt and that's it. But you can also serve them with mashed potatoes, and my grandma did it both ways, and a lot of times she knew that me and my sister loved mashed potatoes, so she would do that just for us, but traditionally it should be regular boiled potatoes. Then we usually had that with some kind of green veggie, and a non-negotiable condiment here is lingonberry sauce. And don't worry if you can't find it because cranberry sauce is really similar, but this, in my opinion, needs to be part of the plate. Lingonberries are very similar to cranberries, and lingonberry sauce is something that you can find a lot of times in the jelly section of your grocery store. I know they have it at Whole Foods. I will link it in the description box below. And it pretty much tastes like cranberry sauce, but it's a little more tart because it doesn't have as much added sugar, but it serves the same kind of function. You know what? Thanksgiving or the holidays, you have a little cranberry sauce on the side with something that's really savory and has lots of gravy, and there's just something delicious about that sweet and tart and bright with the rich and savory and hearty. Like, that combination is just so good, and the same is true here. The way to get the perfect bite is to get a little bit of the lingonberry sauce, a little bit of the potato, tomato, and then a piece of the meatball with lots of gravy. That right there is just going to be an absolutely delightful mouthful. And I'm telling you, as soon as I take a bite, it immediately takes me back to family dinners with my grandma and my family. It's really amazing how food and smell and even just the look of it, like a meal like that on a plate, just instantly makes me feel really warm and cozy, because that's the kind of food I loved growing up, and it reminds me of my family, which is kind of why I wanted to do this series in general, because I know that family recipes are so much more than food, and we have so many memories associated. I'm getting emotional. We have so many memories associated with them, and it really can be so comforting to know that you can still enjoy meals. Oh my gosh, I'm actually getting emotional. But you can still enjoy meals like this and just not include animals, you know? Like, you don't have to give that up just because you want to go vegan. So I would love to help veganize some of your favorite family recipes, and thank you to everyone who sent me your recipes so far. I've got a list going. I'm doing my research. I can't wait to get started. But if you want to send me a family recipe to veganize in a future episode, please go ahead and email me here. And I hope you guys enjoy this recipe. It's gonna be linked in the description box below. If you've never had Norwegian food before, this is pretty classic, so it'll give you a good idea of what it's all about. If you guys enjoyed this video and you're excited to see another episode in this series, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed, and I will see you in a video very soon. Bye.